Hello and welcome to the fourth discussion in this Queen's University online course, Identity, Conflict and Public Space, Contest and Transformation. My name is Dominic Bryan. I'm the Director of the Institute of Irish Studies. I have with me an anthropologist, a social psychologist and a sociologist. Milena Komarova works at the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation and Social Justice. Sam Pehrson works at the Centre for Identity and Intergroup Relations, and Neil Jarman also works at the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation and Social Justice. In the discussion that we're going to have, we want to look particularly at a case study of how the state works with intergroup relations. We're going to look at the place that we're familiar with, at the place we're sitting in at the moment, Northern Ireland. But before we do, I want to set the scene by having a little discussion about the nature of divided societies around the world. Milena, there are various ways in which the state becomes engaged in fostering ethno-national divisions. What is frequently the role of the state in the sort of divisions that we're interested in?
Well, it's worth noting that the effects on divisions between communities that involve the state would very often come from an attempt to actually manage the conflict between people and communities. So that can take the shape of building various infrastructures which effectively divide people. For instance, walls, roads. Another form which division between people can take is through education, segregation in education, or segregation in places of work. In all of these instances, the state has a central role to play to regulate and manage relationships.
And sometimes the state will also simply suppress a minority group. It will disempower certain groups within the state in an attempt to try and control what's taking place.
That's right, and it's worth noting particularly where physical infrastructure is concerned, that once these divisions are put in place, they begin to perpetuate divisions by themselves. So once physical divisions are in place, other social divisions are being perpetuated and made to last longer.
Yeah, I'm keen that we come back to that, because we're going to be interested in how that transformation process, the change process might take place. But it's interesting to think of some of the examples of where division has become highly instituted. Neil, I mean, I can think of sort of the former Yugoslavia as one example. What are some of the examples that occur to you in terms of this process taking place?
Well, you can see on some level divisions happen without elements of conflict. So you'll see that where distinctive ethnic groups or religious groups are living in a society, they may well be living in segregated areas, living with their own people rather than with other people. And that may happen without the state's involvement. You may also find issues around ethnic cleansing. As tensions move up, people move away from their neighbours, they move into more segregated areas. But then the state can also play a role in exacerbating those divisions, or as Milena said, they may take steps to increase people's sense of safety, but by doing so, by creating a sense of division. So you can see in Belfast, numerous walls and barriers have been built between segregated Catholic and Protestant areas since the late 1960s to help provide a sense of security, but they also create a sense of division. You saw the same situation in Cyprus, for example, after the Turkish invasion in 1974. The island divided into north and south, with the Green Line acting as an international border between the two, and Nicosia becoming completely divided into two cities. You've seen it also more recently in Israel and Palestine, with the separation wall being built by the Israelis around Palestine to exclude and divide but also on one level to provide a sense of security and safety for the Israeli society against attacks from Palestinians. So they're often complex processes, but as Milena was saying, those sensitive divisions serve to reinforce the differences between the two populations or three populations, particularly if they are physically manifested through walls and barriers and such like.
So it's about, Sam, it's still about intergroup relations, isn't it? I mean, as Neil points out there, it's still about, you don't need to have a state there for, as we know, for groups to see themselves as different.
No, that's right. And perhaps another thing I would add there to, the various dynamics that might produce segregation without necessarily state involvement would be the aspect of inequality, and particularly economic equality. So if we're talking about societies in which there is perhaps a stratification in terms of ethnic groups, having different levels of wealth and power and so forth, then those sorts of inequalities also produce segregation because of where people can afford to live, where they can work and so forth. And certainly we see that in many parts of Europe, in the United States, for example, where there's really quite stark residential segregation, which is not any longer backed up by the state deliberately. Of course, it was in the past, but not any longer. But those that form of segregation exists and perpetuated mainly through economic inequality.
Yeah. Well, having discussed the nature of divided societies generally, I think we'll turn now to think about the state that we sit in at the moment.
Before you do that, Dominic, can I just come in and pick up on that level of segregation, that level of residential and so forth segregation, has a very real impact on issues such as public space in divided societies, because it transforms the nature of some of that public space. You may end up with public space that functions in most European societies between residential areas and urban and central areas where people live and then when people go to shop and so forth. But when you have divided societies, those spaces, particularly residential spaces, but also some commercial spaces, can be perceived as being associated only with one community, and therefore the other communities don't see them as public spaces, and they become public spaces for one community to use, but not public spaces for the whole community.
So you have real inequalities of access.
You can have inequalities of access to services. It may limit your access to health facilities. It may limit your access to employment if you don't feel safe moving to a certain area. It may also limit access to participation in public rituals or in public ceremonies or in commemorations, and it may lead to a sense that of fostering this sense of inequality that one community has greater access to public space and the other community is denied that access.
In a sense, there are limitations on one group's sense of citizenship.
Absolutely, they are visibly seen as second-class citizens, so they don't have the same rights and accesses as the other communities do.
Yeah,
and interestingly, this can happen without it being necessarily explicit or deliberate from the point of view of the state, and indeed it might be that an inattention to difference and inequality means that by default, almost, or by the sort of inequality of power and so forth, it's a dominant group that takes ownership of the public sphere and the public space. And multiculturalism would be, on the face of it, perhaps a more deliberate recognition of difference. It's often one which is motivated by wanting to recognise difference in a way that's inclusive, because of the fact that ignoring difference can lead to these kinds of exclusion that Neil's talking about.
And it also,
No, I was simply going to kind of partly return to a discussion that we were having earlier, but also in the hope to make a bridge to our following discussion. All these processes that were just discussed actually alter the symbolic context of cultural contestation that takes place in such spaces. So that when we talked earlier about various identities and various groups coexisting in public space and expressing their identities to each other through some sort of common symbolism, for instance, the flag of the state, etc. These symbols then become associated and divided with different territories and different communities and different identities, which goes then to the heart of the ritual expression of identity which is parading.
And I think it also links back to the role of the state and the responsibility of the state. That the state can very often, in terms of urban spaces, take a very laissez-faire attitude, and you end up with the situation that Sam was describing. But if you look at it from a human rights perspective, you'd see that the state has both a negative obligation not to interfere unnecessarily to stop people doing things, but it also has a positive obligation to ensure that people have equal rights and equal access to rights. And sometimes the failure to intervene can mean that one community dominates, and the state has a responsibility to intervene to ensure that all communities have that sense of access to public space and ability to display their symbols and rituals and so forth. That can lead to questions around social engineering, but sometimes social engineering in divided societies is an important part of oiling the wheels of daily life.
Well, let's return to the role of the state and human rights shortly, but for now I'd like to think about the place that we're sitting in here, think about the state of Northern Ireland, which has been contested since it was set up in 1921, and think about the role of public space in that period. So the state of Northern Ireland came into being in 1921. It divided the island of Ireland, and it left, whilst the southern part of the island became an independent state, now known as the Republic of Ireland. The northern part of the island had a large Protestant population that believes itself to, or has an identity of being British and wanted to remain a part of the United Kingdom. So, as often happens, governments came up with what effectively a sort of fudge as to how you're going to deal with these divisions, and the state of Northern Ireland had about 2/3 of the population feeling itself to be British and Protestant, and 1/3 of the population feeling itself that was Catholic, feeling itself to be Irish. All right, and on that basis, we ended up with a divided society with a lot of those Catholic Irish people feeling excluded from the nature of the state. Given that background, Neil, can you tell us a little bit about what the effects that had in public space of that division in this state, and particularly maybe in Belfast, the city that we sit in?
Well, I think one of the factors behind the division was the partition of Ireland was to create a space that was felt to be securely dominated by the Protestant community, and we have the phrase that gets recounted of Northern Ireland being a Protestant state for a Protestant people, which in its phraseology excludes the Catholics from a presence there, so that you had a government in Northern Ireland which was dominated by the Unionist communities, those who favoured the union with Britain. Catholic political parties were in the minority. And then this was played out in the public sphere through differential access to be able to use public space to commemorate key events, to celebrate key activities, and to display one's collective identity. So that you had, from the 1920s, parades by Protestant organisations such as the Orange Order or the Apprentice Boys of Derry becoming very popular and closely linked in with the political elite. So they became almost like events of state ceremonials. And each year you had big parades supported very heavily by the Protestant community, taking place town centres, city centres, all over Northern Ireland.
And the Prime Minister of the day would always make a speech at those
Senior politicians were heavily involved in them, and as you say, the Prime Minister make speeches and so forth. The contrast, and at the same time while those events were taking place, the area may be decorated in the red, whites and blues and various flags and buntings associated with the British identity. In contrast, if members of the Catholic population wanted to celebrate or commemorate elements of their history, their sense of identity, they were generally constrained to areas dominated by Catholics, and often more into residential areas rather than the town centres or the central urban areas. So that public space was very much dominated by displays of the Protestant community, and the Catholic community were largely excluded from that public
so
space.
you couldn't organise a demonstration, for instance, with an Irish tricolour, a flag of the Irish Republic, and walk into the centre of Belfast holding it?
No, I think the first time an Irish tricolour was carried into the centre of Belfast was in 1993.
Yeah.
Until then, it had been effectively excluded from the central city, even though by that time Belfast's population was approaching 50-50 in terms of Catholics and Protestants.
So we have a fairly good example here of how the state has taken on an identity reflecting, in this case, a majority of the population, but in doing so, excluding 1/3 of the population, and this goes to that sort of idea of the notion of citizenship, about whether people feel included or not within the state. And there's many debates in Northern Ireland about the nature of discrimination and how Catholics were excluded, whether they excluded themselves, as people often. But what I think is generally agreed on is that the sense of citizenship didn't exist broadly within the Catholic community. And the key then comes in this negotiation of public space around the civil rights movement. How important do you think it was that the civil rights movement in 1967 grew up around demands for fair jobs, fair houses, and fair votes for Catholics? All right. How important, though, do you think it was that civil rights movement manifested itself by using demonstrations, by actually demanding to be in that public space?
Well, I think you have to look and see that exclusion from public space, exclusion from citizenship were important factors. But when you go to those levels of discrimination and division, it does, as Milena spoke about earlier, it does spread through all elements of society. So you have residential segregation, you have segregation in schooling, you have discrimination in the workplace, a whole variety of factors. And then you have to remember that was based upon a balance of population of 2/3 to 1/3. But population balances are not necessarily static. Populations change. And in Northern Ireland, we saw that the Catholic population increased faster than the Protestant population. So you had higher levels of, or different levels of imbalances. The gap between the two communities starts to narrow. Then after the Education Acts and changes in education, you had higher levels of Catholics going through better quality education, coming and having greater expectations of being treated equally within the workplace. So you had, and you must remember, it took more than 40 years for this process to work its way through. We're talking of a shift from the 1920s to the civil rights movement emerging in the 1960s, following on from learning lessons from what had happened in the USA with the civil rights movement in the USA, and very much taking the form of, we need to come together, we need to make our case for equality collectively. We need to take it around the state. We need to mobilise people. Some of the issues we were talking about in earlier discussions, that collective identities are much more powerful when people come together, when they take their demands into public space. And that's what we saw about in the 1960s, as people began to argue for greater equality between the two communities. And you have to remember that it wasn't only Catholics demanding equality, it was members of the Protestant community
as well, yes.
demanding civil rights for all as well.
But it's very striking that the clashes they effectively have with the state come when they demand to walk in to some of these central spaces, some of these places where previously an orange Protestant parade would have taken place, but there hadn't been large amounts of opposition, so that the physicality of holding a civil rights demonstration and demanding to be in the town centre or a city centre appears to then become very destabilising for the state.
Well, you have to remember as well that it wasn't just a matter of the state saying the Protestant community can do this and the Catholic community can't do this. Those inequalities were backed up not only by law but by power, and particularly in the power through the police, which was seen as being a partisan force backing up the Protestant state, overwhelmingly Protestant in membership, so that you had a sense in which the state's power was becoming more nakedly aggressive and more visibly aggressive at the same time. So the confrontation wasn't just between Protestants and Catholics, it was between Protestants and Catholics, with Protestants being backed up by armed police, by a whole array of security measures and special powers and legislation which allowed the police to control people and restrict the freedom of assembly, the right to march and the right to demonstrate.
We're leaving us from 69 onwards to a much more violent conflict between the two communities, involving paramilitary groups, and basically leading us to 30 years of violence which led to at least 3,500 deaths, and a constant effort or an efforts by the state, the British state and others, to look for some solutions, really being problematic right up until the 1990s. But I want to move to the 1990s. There was an agreement, political agreement in 1998 involving British and Irish governments and all of the parties here. Milena, that agreement had ideas such as parity of esteem and human rights in it. What effect do you think the nature of that agreement had on how people might have viewed the public space, what their expectations might be?
Well, at the first glance, paradoxically, what we saw almost immediately after the agreement was an intensification of conflict in public space. And I say this is a paradox only at the first glance, because on another hand, you can expect that the agreement had the effect of effectively giving people permission to claim public space
to
as
claim their
civic
citizenship.
and common space. Exactly, to claim their citizenship. So, in effect, people were out and performing and claiming their citizenship in that way. On another hand, agreements are crucial. Obviously, they create frameworks for what is to happen, but that process has to work itself on the ground. The belief in a common civic culture has to develop as a social process, not simply as a political process. And therefore, we see all of these various forms of contestation taking place in public space.
So we had some really large confrontations around the rights of people to hold marches and parades, because we had historically within the state, we'd had this tradition of Orangemen having processions on the public road and having what they describe as their traditional orange parades, many of which would have gone into town centres, but some of which would have also gone in areas which now are seen very much residentially as Catholic. We had this, we had a whole series of contestations where Catholic residents groups were protesting that these parades were going through these areas. And it seems to me so interesting that just as you get to a peace process, the state has to sit down and try and work out, well, look, if we're going to offer everybody citizenship, then we're also going to work out how we manage these contested identities. You have Orangemen who are saying, well, this is part of our British identity, these are our traditional parades, this is how we express ourselves, our religious and cultural identity. And then you will have Irish nationalists and Republicans saying that that parade represents a state that oppressed us, it's an act of coat trailing, it's sectarian and it's anti-Catholic, and that you have these two groups with very emotionally strongly felt political views, which have been violently manifested for 30 years, now being managed on the street. Neil, thinking back to that period in the 1990s around the peace process, what were the arguments being made, the key arguments being made by the protagonists around the right to parade, and how did the state react to all of that? Since it was trying to promote a peace process, this wasn't now a Northern Ireland government, this was the British government involved. How did the state react to that?
Well, I think from one point of view, the state wasn't expecting that level of contest on the streets. I mean, we can see why it arose and why it came from, but certainly after you had the armed groups, the paramilitary organisations declaring a ceasefire, people were expecting to move, or on some level expecting to move into a process of peace, a much more peaceful society. But of course, if you start to rebalance and readdress issues of equality and inequalities, one person's or one community's gains in equality can be seen by the other side as a loss. So you end up people looking at it in terms of zero-sum terms rather than in win-win solutions. So there's a sense that if they're gaining something, we must be losing something, which raises tensions between people on a different level. And I think you saw that from a very early stage. You saw a sense of expectation from within the Catholic community that there would be a focus on rebalancing issues of equality. And although there hadn't been great tensions around parades over the previous 30 years, they'd been relatively latent. You know, it wasn't that people weren't opposed to the parades, they just had other things to focus on.
In the violence that was consuming, there were bigger problems.
There were bigger problems to deal with, so that the parades came into focus. It was almost as the dust clears from the military conflict, the parades step back up and come to the fore. A sense of opportunity, a sense of resurgence of confidence within the nationalist community in working class areas to start to raise some objections towards some of the parades, while at the same time on the Protestant side feeling that they had an opportunity, a right to exercise their freedoms and can carry on with their traditions. What you didn't get was a sense of compromise or willingness to compromise between the two communities. On one hand, you had the political elite negotiating the agreement and trying to work through some levels of compromises, and on the ground you had much more polarised positions. And coming back into that situation, the decisions at the time were being over whether a parade should be allowed to take place or whether it should be restricted in some way, were being made by the police, who themselves were not being seen as a neutral body, but were seen as a problematic organisation. And as we know that as part of the peace agreement, the policing was thoroughly reformed and restructured, so that you had a complex situation where the two communities were at odds with one another in many areas. The police were another factor coming into play, and all this was largely an unexpected situation, which the government did not have the capacity, the wherewithal to manage and address in without it escalating to a considerable extent. So we had the situation in 1996 and 1997, as the peace negotiations were being played through, that the parades became a real counterpoint to political negotiations, that you might be seeking some level of agreement on one level, but on the streets.
And at the time, it felt like it had real potential. These very emotive events had real potential to possibly bring the peace process down.
Well, you regularly had, in the summer months, you had the headlines of Northern Ireland on the brink, staring into the abyss, which is not surprising if you have a week's length of rioting with thousands of plastic bullets being fired, of people being killed, people rioting all over the place, virtually impossible to move around safely at certain times, and never sure whether you're going to get home, people leaving work early to make sure they got home before the rioting started. There was serious trouble in the late 1990s.
So you have this interesting sort of contradiction that you're trying to set up a peace agreement which offers people a sense of citizenship, and inbuilt in an idea of citizenship is that people have the right to freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. However, of course, if you're in a heavily divided society, your one person's expression of that freedom of speech or freedom of assembly might involve expressing your identity, but that identity, which might be walking down the road with an Irish tricolour or walking down the road with a British Union flag, is a direct threat potentially to the other. And it seems to me, Milena, it's not easily dismissed, because, I mean, if you've had a violent conflict, those symbols are also, they may be symbols of states, but they're also for other people symbols of violence and threat.
Absolutely, yes, and especially in a post-conflict situation where you've had an agreement, a political agreement, but we still have a wide-ranging social process of people working out those differences on the ground. These ritualistic expressions of identity through symbols, through parading and so on, can be perceived as particularly exclusive or excluding to others, threatening, aggressive, intimidating.
Yeah, so if you, and on top of all of that, if you've had, as in almost all wars, when a state finishes a war, it commemorates its dead, and all nations and states have done that over the years and build the memorials. However, if you're in a divided society like this, you've got both groups wanting to commemorate and remember its dead almost effectively in the same spaces. So you can't have a shared commemorative act that remembers the conflict, because the act of commemoration that people have, of necessity divide people. So that you end up with some people saying that they want to remember those people that fought to protect their communities, and other people saying, well, hold on a minute, no, they were terrorists. They were the ones that were attacking us and attacking the state.
And you also have to remember that when the dates when history books recall the end of a conflict will almost inevitably be an end of a certain part of the conflict, the heavily militarized conflict. We have dates in 1945 from when the war in Europe came to an end and the war in Japan in the Far East came to an end. But for many people in continental Europe, the war didn't end then. it went on through acts of retribution, acts of resistance. And in some cases, in going into the Baltic areas and the Ukraine, people were still fighting until 1948, 1949. Just like we know about the Japanese soldiers who stayed on in the islands in the Pacific. That happened across Europe. In other countries, as societies are re-establishing themselves, people take revenge on treatment that they suffered and on people who might have been collaborators. And we had the same situation in Northern Ireland. The paramilitary organisations declared a ceasefire in 1994. But for the rest of society, for large chunks of society, the animosities hadn't been addressed at that stage. The fears, the suspicions, the levels of mistrust, the antipathy they felt towards other members of the other community hadn't been addressed. And we now see here now 15, 20 years after the agreements, 20 years after the peace process began, we're still working through that. There's still that levels of mistrust.
You have that key problem that you have a divided society on a residential basis, and we have walls dividing people in Northern Ireland, people who see themselves as British and Protestant and Catholic and nationalist. And you have a history there of violence, but you also have an attempt in a peace process to have a common, a democratic state where people have the right to express their citizenship. So the problem, and I suppose the one that interests us here and that we will talk about more in our next discussion, is how do you manage those sort of differences? Where do the boundaries lie about people's expression of identity and freedom of assembly when you have such significant divisions?
Yes, and perhaps one thing that it was mentioned by Sam, and it's important again to go back to at this point, is that those differences are not simply cultural and political differences. They're also differences of social class. I mean, if we look at the latest figures from the census of 2011, we know from that about 37% of electoral wards in Northern Ireland as a whole are segregated along ethno-national lines, but 91% of wards which are public housing are segregated. So you can see that the question of social class is fundamental to divisions in this society.
And if you're going to create a context in which those divisions between the ethno-national groups can be addressed, I think one of the fundamental factors is for to reform the state and establish institutions around governance that people can have confidence in and have trust in. And that's what the agreement was about. The agreement wasn't a peace agreement between people on the ground.
No.
It was a peace agreement about establishing new institutions that could provide the institutional framework for people to live peacefully and equitably together.
It doesn't offer you an instant integrated society by any manner of
It starts to set the structure and the architecture for a state which will treat people equally and fairly. But it will always take time for people to develop confidence and trust that those institutions are going to do so, particularly if they've lived for 50, 60, 70 years, where the institutions of state have discriminated against. So the state has to provide the foundations for which divided societies, the communities within the identities in there, can start to become less divided and more integrated.
In this discussion, we've looked much more specifically at divided societies, and we are interested in how public space is managed in a divided society. And there are lots of examples of such divided societies around the world, but we've taken as an example the society that we live in Northern Ireland, and we've looked at the way the involvement of the state in certain respects fostering divisions, ethno-national divisions, in its management of that public space and how that management became problematic. And then we've talked a little about, in a peace process, the real quandary of how you manage people's rights to freedom of assembly, how you manage access to that public space when you have identities that are very confrontational to each other. And in the next discussion, we're going to think more closely about what are the ways that transformation can take place and that the management of public space might be facilitated.